This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for this program is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is the second time that Wayne Dowdy has been on this program. He's one of our go-to historians whenever we do our Memphis Memoirs series. He's also the agency manager of the history department at the Benjamin L. Hooks Central Library. He's written a new book, and it's called On This Day in Memphis History. And of course, it is always a pleasure to have you on the program, Wayne.
Thanks, Pierre.
Well, first off, I know you love history.
I do indeed.
And here you have the largest archive, one of the largest archives in Shelby County, if not the largest archive. You must feel like a chocoholic who's running a candy store.
Well, I think that's yeah. I do. I mean, every day, I learn something new about Memphis history just by doing my job, and so I'm sort of turned loose in the archives, and so I get to combine not only what I do for a living, but also what I'm very passionate about, which is telling people about Memphis history. So every day I get to learn something new, and then also get to pass it along to our customers.
But the interesting thing too is that you must run into a lot of history, quite obviously, that doesn't easily fit into any kind of category.
That's right. That's right. And over the years, one of the things that, for example, someone comes in and asks a question. So one of the things we do is we go to our Memphis Information File, which is a collection of newspaper clippings and other small items arranged by subject. So you go in and you go to the file and you pull this out. Well, oftentimes what will happen, either what they have asked for, I find very, very interesting, and say, ooh, let me, when they get finished with this, let me make a copy of that and put it in a file, or something that's behind it or in front of it. And I go, wait a minute, what is this? And I didn't know that, and so I would just save those things. And you're right, sometimes they're small stories, they're fascinating stories, but they don't fit in a larger sort of narrative.
And that is where On This Day in Memphis History comes in.
That's right.
Because all of those little tidbits that you collected over time, you had a chance to put in this wonderful book.
That's right.
Which, by the way, I call this a potato chip book because you can't just eat one. You can't just read one of these stories and put it down. And I have a few examples. Well, first off, what is your favorite example of a story that came out of this particular book?
I think one of my favorites. One of the things about this that I wanted to do was to write about some people and events that I'd never had a chance to write about, as we were saying. And one of my favorite Memphians, Memphis historical figures, is a man named Watson Davis, who also went by the stage name Savad. And Savad hosted a TV show called Fantastic Features on WHBQ from 1962 to 72. And Savad is sort of the first media figure that I paid attention to when I was a kid. I was born 2 years after the show debuted. And so when I was 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, Savad is someone who came into my living rooms, and he scared the crap out of me. and everybody who knew me when I was that age, our neighbors, our family, Savad was just loomed large in my life. So, but there was never a place to write about him. So one of the entries is, in many ways, my favorite is the debut night of Fantastic Features, and being able to talk about someone who was part of my childhood. And it's hard to think sometimes that your childhood was history too, but it has been, and so that's a favorite. There's so many of them are favorites.
Well, I've seen the footage of Savad and heard the stories, about how he he was so creative, you know, and especially working in that time in
Right.
television, because when he started out, it wasn't particularly a mobile medium
That's
like
right.
it is now.
Right.
And he manages to get that great open where they get the horses and the casket and
In
the whole
Overton
thing.
Park, can you imagine trying to
Yeah.
film that?
I mean, that was quite a production
Yeah,
to pull off
right.
at that time. You know? Well, I've got some dates and I've got some headings of some stories that you wrote about. The first thing that caught my attention was the German prisoner who fled with another man's wife.
That's right. He was working in a plantation in Mississippi, just not far from Memphis. And,
In Grenada.
Grenada, that's
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And he sparked a relationship with the plantation owner's wife. And one afternoon, apparently they would eat communally lunch out in the yard. And so all the prisoners ate, and then she invited him into the house to have a glass of wine. And so after several drinks, they concocted this idea, well, you know, let's just run away. And so they flee to Memphis, and of course there's
And it all sounds so melodramatic, you know, because what is it? His name is Helmut von something or other.
That's right. That's right.
Which, if you were writing this, you'd never give that guy that
That's
name.
right. That's right. But what's interesting about that is not only the story itself, but also the fact that there were, you know, hundreds of German prisoners of war who were interned in Memphis. And in the surrounding area. I mean, you had guys picking cotton like this guy. You had others who were at the Army Quartermaster Depot that became the Defense Depot later.
And that was over where?
It was over in you know, the Defense Depot over there.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you had all these guys who came, and so the trick in writing something like this is not only to tell that individual story, but also to try to put it in some kind of context. And so within a very short, I mean, the entries are you know, a maximum of 260, 270
Right.
words. So trying to do that in an economical way, but also put it into context. And so in this case, you know, I mentioned how many German prisoners were in Memphis during that time, and also the fact there was a man named Edwin Pells who was a prisoner here, fell in love with the city, was eventually sent back to Germany. But he comes back in the 1970s with his family and reunites with some of those who had held him prisoner and Memphians whom he had come into contact with during his work while he was a prisoner here. So you know, so all of that is fascinating.
Yeah, in fact, you see that you see that in a lot of ways. My mother's French, and some of the Germans who were part of the German Navy were in La Rochelle, and then after the war they came back. And it should be said that the German sailors who were in La Rochelle didn't have the kind of bad reputation that the SS and the Gestapo and the more, you know, evil parts of the Nazi regime did. Speaking of the Nazi regime, Memphis Nazi Blitzkrieg's beauty shop. And what fascinated me about this particular story, this is January the 18th, 1943, that we, during World War II, have a real life Nazi sympathizer in the middle of Memphis.
That's right.
How in the world did this guy get away with
Well,
it?
and what's interesting about that is that's an example of a story that I found looking for another story for a customer. Somebody, and I pulled the file and I saw this and it said Memphis Nazi or something, and I pulled it out. I was like, oh, this is a great story. I need to save this. So William Castens was a German immigrant, came here in, I believe, in the 1920s, late 1920s, opened a beauty shop here, had also a young women's finishing course that they offered, a beauty course that they offered. It's a very popular beauty shop in town. And but in the late 1930s, he starts to say publicly that he supports Adolf Hitler and he supports the Nazi regime and thinks they're doing wonderful things for Germany. You know, at first, no one pays much attention to this because
It's not really on the radar.
That's
yet,
right. That's
you know.
right. But by 1940, he becomes more shrill about his support, and American public opinion, Memphis public opinion, is really hardening against Germany at this point.
Right.
And so people begin to shun him, and they stop going to this beauty shop. And within a short time, the owners, it was in the Perel and Lowenstein's building downtown, he can't pay his rent, so they kick him out. And so they lease the beauty shop to someone else. And he was in such dire straits, he wasn't even able to pay for the equipment that he had leased, and some of it he had bought on time and hadn't paid off yet, financed it. And so he's in terrible financial shape. And so he loses his business, he's destitute. America enters the war in 41, but his feelings towards Nazi Germany only grows, and he comes to really despise Perel and Lowenstein's in particular, and the person who bought the shop or rented the shop after him. So one Sunday, which beauty shops are not open on Sunday, he decides to exact revenge, and he breaks into the beauty shop and just totally destroys everything in there. He takes a knife and rips the seat covers off the seats, destroys equipment, and breaks windows. And but he goes back home, and police put two and two together pretty quickly, and come and arrest him, and he's put on trial very quickly, and found guilty of damaging property and so on, and is sentenced to 10 years in prison.
10 years.
And but what
Well, I'm sure that gave him an excuse to keep an eye on this.
Yes,
guy.
right, indeed. And I wasn't able to find out what happened to him after he got out of prison, whether he came back to Memphis or settled somewhere else, or even perhaps he didn't survive prison. I don't know, but that's an example of something that what is happening in the rest of the world has an impact on Memphis.
Sure.
And Memphians get a small taste of what's happening to Europeans under Nazi rule.
Right. Yeah, and it was such an in-your-face kind of situation with that guy that it really struck me. I mean, it's where I grew up in Florida. During the war, they had instances where U-boats would surface, out there off the coast, But it's not as if, Memphis was in any danger of having a U-boat surface in the Mississippi River.
Right. That's right. But Castens was a naturalized citizen. I mean, he lived here for a very long time, and I think it was a shock to many.
Oh, sure. Well, now. You also have something that really struck me. There's some serious. There's a lot of serious things in this book as well, where you have the city official opposes desegregation of airport restaurant, and I thought the circumstances surrounding that was pretty amazing. Explain.
Well, the mayor is the city official is Mayor Henry Loeb, and Carl Rowan, who was a well-known African-American columnist, also went to work for the federal government, and
in particular the Kennedy administration.
That's right.
This we should point out that this is January the 24th, 1962.
Right, and so Rowan is coming back from a trip, and he comes through Memphis, and he's hungry, so he goes into the airport restaurant, which is the Dobbs House, and a lot of Memphians may remember that. And but they refuse to serve him because he's African American, and this is a huge embarrassment to the city. And Claude Armour, who was Fire and Police Commissioner, said at one point, "Well, thank God we didn't arrest him. How it would have been even worse." But Dobbs House, after this incident, essentially wants to desegregate. This was an embarrassing episode for them. The courts have been pretty clear about interstate travel and desegregating places that are related to interstate commerce and interstate travel. But of course, they hadn't gotten around to the Memphis airport at that point. And so so the Dobbs House wants to desegregate, but they are under contract to the airport, and the airport authority essentially has to make that decision along with the city commission. Well, the city commissioners, other than Mayor Loeb, also want to desegregate, but it is Mayor Loeb who is opposed to desegregation, and he's, Loeb at this time, first term as mayor, early 1960s. Loeb had served as a PT boat commander in World War II. That gave him a connection to John Kennedy, who also was. And he had worked on the Kennedy campaign, and but he was not invited to the inauguration. And apparently someone in the state, some state official or state Democratic official, party official, didn't add his name. So he was not inclined to support anything that the Kennedy administration was doing in 1962.
Yeah, and it was also indicative of the problem that Kennedy had in the early part of his administration with the Southern Democrats. Here, Kennedy wanted to go in a certain direction.
That's right.
With civil rights, and then he had George Wallace in Alabama,
Well, and Loeb had, Loeb notwithstanding, the Kennedy administration believed that Memphis was a model for how desegregation could take place. There had been sit-ins earlier in 1960 and into 61, but a compromise had been reached between city officials, local businesses, and the NAACP that led to desegregation not only of public facilities like the library and museums, but also the downtown lunch counters, and also an agreement to hire African Americans as to wait behind the counter to be clerical, service staff.
Right.
And so those kinds of things, the city does token desegregation of schools in 61. So, the Kennedy administration sees Memphis very much as a model of what the South should be doing, and despite Loeb's opposition.
Well, let's go to some good news here. Zachary Taylor visits Memphis, February the 3rd, 1849. Taylor was interesting because, because he didn't have a very long term. No,
he didn't, and he floats down the river to Memphis on his way to Washington to be inaugurated president, and he gets here, and they whisk him to the Gayoso House, and there's a nice, wonderful party there, and the newspapers report, how much the ladies liked the president-elect, and
we should point out that this is February the 3rd, 1849.
That's right.
This is going on. Yeah.
But what's interesting about Taylor is he doesn't serve very long. He gets ill and dies in the White House, but he is responsible in large part for, or at least supporting, the Compromise of 1850, which created. Initiated bringing in a couple of free states and slave states, and also the fugitive slave law and all of that, and so it was a very short presidency, but significant for that because the country was beginning to tear itself apart.
Now, some of the unusual things that pop up in the book. Is July the 26th, 1922. City pool is so popular it has to close.
That's right. The city opened,
I love these headlines. That's another thing. You should look at a career as a headline writer if this history thing doesn't work out.
Well, I'll keep that in mind. But the city opens its first public pool, and thousands of Memphians, flock to this pool to enjoy, a respite from the warm weather, but unfortunately, some of the concrete barricades and there may have been shoddy construction or whatever, but it becomes a safety hazard very, very quickly, and so they've got to drain the pool.
And this is around the fairgrounds.
That's right. This is in the fairgrounds.
Right, around 1922 or something like that.
1922, that's right.
Yeah.
And So, you know, that kind of construction is not as easy perhaps as it is today. And so they had to drain that pool and make the repairs.
And they claimed that there was like bacteria growing in the thing. And,
right.
And I mean, it was a really scary situation.
Right.
They had to go back in and I think talk about how they were purifying the
That's
water
right.
and sending it back into the pool. And
That's right.
But then there was the thing that got me to laughing was was the fact that the 1922 bathing suit on women didn't reveal very much anyway, but there were complaints about how much it did reveal.
That's right.
And I think didn't the Baptists get involved in this?
The Baptist Women's Association, I believe.
Yeah. That's right.
And you know, saying how horrible it was that men and women were swimming in the same pool at the same time, and also complaining about how risque the outfits were.
I love the fact that they referred to it as a virtual hellhole.
Which, yeah, their definition of that and ours is quite different now.
That was fascinating. 1919. Memphis is declared, a grand jury declares Memphis to be a lawless town.
As if they just discovered this, right? And that's what was fascinating to me is you know, this there was always this periodic sort of attempts to reform Memphis,
right.
And Memphis in large part would resist those kinds of things, but this civic organization, you know, and others like the Baptist Women's Association and organizations like that are
right.
complaining all the time about gambling in particular, and so the county grand jury gets you know, gets these cases, and so they decide in their report at the end of the term to lay out this argument about how lawless Memphis is, and how gamblers are allowed to run free in the city, and prostitution and all of these kinds of things. And in 1919, I mean, the city essentially had, there were several gangsters who operated within the city. There had been, beginning in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, the Irish gangs for the most part. By 1919 and into the 20s, the Irish gangsters were all dying off, either killing themselves or, you know, killing each other,
right.
or dying of old age, and you had Italians start to take over some of that territory. But organized crime remained a factor in Memphis life well into the late 1930s, and so this is always something that people are coming along and, you know, complaining. But what I found interesting was some of the details that they provided, and it just gives a window into that time and how crime is always a problem.
You know, there was when you do some research on documentaries, you're struck by how certain people in this town have captured the memory of the town, and an example of that was Alonzo Locke. It never ceases to amaze me how Alonzo Locke, and there are people in this city who will talk about Alonzo Locke as if you know, he was around 15 minutes ago,
right.
But he passed in 1947, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And that's one of the things in the book. I remember one lady saying that Alonzo Locke remembered your name. He was, by the way, it should be said that he was the head. Was he the head waiter?
He was the head waiter at the Peabody.
At the Peabody
restaurant.
If he met you, he would remember your name, your grandchildren's name, your children's name, and even relatives in your family.
That's right.
Yeah.
And also remember what you had the last time, and would give you a recommendation whether today's, you know, service was going to be the same as if the food was as good as it was before,
right.
And recommend, well, maybe you don't want to have that, maybe you should have this instead.
Also, we just have a few minutes left, but you have one in particular that I thought was really interesting, where you talk about Machine Gun Kelly and his lawyer.
That's right, and his lawyer was his brother-in-law. and he was Machine Gun Kelly shows up in town, on the lam, so to speak. And Machine Gun Kelly is actually a guy named George Barnes who went to Central High School and was sort of a small-time bootlegger before he became famous as Machine Gun Kelly, and he's looking for a place to stay, and his brother-in-law Ramsey doesn't want him to stay at the house, but he does help him find a place to stay. And for that, when Machine Gun Kelly is arrested in Memphis, he is arrested as well, and goes to prison, loses his law license, and when he gets out of federal prison, comes back and becomes a door-to-door salesman, because he can't be a lawyer anymore. And he's...
That is fascinating. Yeah. I mean, and this book is filled with stories like this. On this day in Memphis history, Wayne Dowdy, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, sir.